welcome to the webinar on International Cooperation on Border Carbon Adjustments, Assessing the Options. My name is Michael Mealing. I'm Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator. And on the topic of today, for 20 years roughly, we've been discussing the possible use of border carbon adjustments as a tool, as a part of the toolbox on increasingly ambitious climate policy. But for more than a decade, that discussion has really been limited to, well, they've essentially been an option on the shelf, literally. So the policy documents and legislation said an option that shall be explored if there is evidence, etc., of leakage, or there's a concern about competitiveness. This was the case in Europe. Even in California, it was for many, in certain circumstances at least, it was something that was left as an option to be explored. Now we've moved to actually seeing it being implemented, even though the empirical evidence of leakage due to climate policy doesn't necessarily suggest that those conditions have materialized. There's other broader sort of circumstances that have precipitated the move from theory to practice. The EU has a border carbon adjustment that's now in force, and it started operating from October 1 with reporting obligations during a transitional period. Many other jurisdictions are discussing launching or initiating border carbon adjustments of their own, with very different designs, with very different circumstances, what these would adjust for, what these accompany, with different objectives and very different political economy contexts, if one could put it that way. And the reactions have been quite phenomenal. So on the one hand, really exciting to see that the EU CBAM, for instance, has stoked a surge in interest in developing or accelerating carbon pricing around the world, which is a welcome, let's say, side effect almost of the EU CBAM file, of the development, announcement, and now implementation of the EU CBAM. But there's also been a lot of not so positive reactions, criticism that this is protectionism disguised as sort of green policy, even all the way to saying this is the West again trying to impose sort of their will on developing countries, what to do, what climate policies to choose and how to implement them, despite the Paris Agreement leaving that choice to each individual sovereign country. So as we see border carbon adjustments being discussed and emerging in different contexts and different jurisdictions, it's also pretty clear that the designs and the way that they will be implemented will be vastly different if there's not a greater effort to coordinate and harmonize. And with that comes some risks. And our presenter today, presenting an upcoming paper that will be launched before COP, will highlight some of those risks and the importance of cooperation, the potential benefits of cooperation, and explore how precisely we can do, how we might advance cooperation on this rather controversial and yet really important emerging part of climate policy. Our presenter is Haro van Asselt, who is the newly appointed Hatton Professor of Climate Law at the University of Cambridge. And he has slides that he will guide us through as he presents the contents of a report that was co-authored by Haro, by Kasturi Das, Susanne Dröge, and myself. And I'll still be introducing Susanne and Kasturi later when they react to our discussions. I'll go introducing the respective speakers as we get to the respective parts of the webinar. Haro, with that, over to you. Take us through the presentation, please. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Michael, for that introduction and for outlining the context in which our research took place. And good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. Let me go straight to the presentation in that case. So let me start a bit broader than just looking at border carbon adjustments immediately and looking at the trade and climate policy context. We know that about a quarter of global CO2 emissions are ultimately embedded in the goods that are traded across national borders, which ultimately creates some kind of carbon loophole. This is what it's been called as well in emissions accounting, mainly because emissions accounting is under the UNFCCC, so the Framework Convention on Climate Change, territorial based, which can ultimately make it harder to tackle these emissions because who do they belong to? At the same time, when it comes to trade policy, we also know that trade policy can play a positive role in addressing climate change, for example, by facilitating the global diffusion of low carbon products and technologies, as well as, for example, disciplining fossil fuel subsidies and greening aid for trade. So it's therefore a positive sign that what we're seeing these days is a rise of international cooperation when it comes to climate change and trade. And I'll just give you a few examples here. We know that in a number of especially new free trade agreements at the regional level or at the bilateral level, we see any number of new climate-related provisions being adopted. One prominent example may be the EU-Mercosur agreement there. We also see the negotiation of new free trade agreements that are specifically and explicitly focused on climate change and sustainability, with the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability between New Zealand, Norway, and a few other countries, a good example. We also see renewed attention at the World Trade Organization, most notably through the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, which were launched a few years ago, and which now has 75 WTO members among them, as well as the initiative on fossil fuel subsidy reform. But even these initiatives are still scratching the surface. We see a lot of activity, and the list, what you see here, is just initiatives that have been launched in the past year or so. So we now have a coalition of trade ministers on climate. We have an action on climate and trade by the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum. We see among the EU and the US a new transatlantic initiative on sustainable trade. And then we have 3 initiatives that will be introduced in more detail later on in this presentation, namely the OECD International Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches, the Global Arrangement for Sustainable Steel and Aluminium, or GASA, and the G7 Climate Club. While international cooperation may be increasing and these developments may bode well, we can also see a bit of a countervailing trend, and trends that really emphasize the protectionist tendencies that we see in different countries. So we can see this in a variety of measures being adopted to address the problem of carbon leakage, with the EU CBAM as perhaps the most notable example, but also, as I will briefly explain later, other border carbon adjustments are being considered in other countries. But we also see it with a number of green industrial strategies. Of course, the US Inflation Reduction Act is the most prominent example, simply because of its sheer scale, with the initial investment adding up to at least $391 billion in the next decade, but also that might increase over time. We see simultaneously at the EU level, the EU Green Industrial Plan being adopted with the associated Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act. And also we see activity in China, not only through its Made in China 2025 plan, which is heavily focusing on strengthening its low carbon industries, but we also see this emphasized in its 14th 5-year plan. What all of these measures and all of these plans and strategies have in common is that they all amount to direct government interventions in trade flows, which are ultimately justified, among others, by the objective of achieving emission reductions. The other thing that all of them have more or less in common is that cooperation is not the primary consideration for any of these initiatives. Now, against this broader backdrop of, on the one hand, intensifying cooperation on climate change and trade, and on the other hand, this increasing trend of protectionism, what we are seeking to do with this draft report that we're presenting here is to explore the potential of international cooperation on BCAs, and we focus specifically on 3 emerging initiatives. So I already mentioned them: the G7 Climate Club, the GASA, so the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminium, and the OECD's International Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches. And I'll talk about them later in a bit more detail. But let me first say a few things about border carbon adjustments to make sure that we're all on the same page about what they are and what they might want to achieve. Now, a very basic, broad definition that we can adopt about border carbon adjustments, or BCAs, is that they're measures that ultimately seek to alleviate the effects, in some cases negative effects, of uneven climate policies, so countries with different ambitions and different stringency, by either targeting the imports of particular products and or exempting exports. So basically trying to target the carbon content of trade through these measures. Now, border carbon adjustments, when we're talking about the objectives and the rationales for their adoption, very often people think about, or people talk about, addressing the problem of carbon leakage, right? So the objective of making sure that when you implement certain measures within your own jurisdictions, that emissions are not going to go up in another jurisdiction. But border carbon adjustments may also be adopted for other reasons. They might be adopted for economic reasons, for trying to leveling the playing fields in competitive markets. They might be adopted for more coercive reasons, trying to incentivize trade partners to strengthen their own climate policy efforts. They might be adopted for domestic reasons. The only way, for example, to increase ambition might be if you also start to impose measures on the imports in your country, and ultimately making sure that the carbon costs are passed through. And they might be adopted for more geopolitical, more strategic reasons related also to industrial strategy and industrial policy, for example, with a view to diversifying supply chains. And it's important to keep these different rationales in mind because they might also influence the impacts and reactions of border carbon adjustment in third countries, and they may influence also the potential for cooperation. Now, Michael already mentioned it, and of course, when we're talking about border carbon adjustments, most of the focus and most of the talk increasingly is about the European Union's CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which properly came into force only at the beginning of this month. CBAM, as probably most of you will know, targets 6 sectors. So it targets the imports of cement, iron and steel, fertilizer, electricity, as well as hydrogen. And initially, so at the moment, it is focused mainly on reporting of embedded emissions based on either the declared emissions data by an importer or certain default values. And then when we move on and look ahead, from the 1st of January 2026, this is when the BCA would come fully into force, because at that point, also importers would be required to purchase certificates, which ultimately are tracking the prices of EU ETS allowances. Now, the idea for the EU with its CBAM has been to replace the existing and somewhat inefficient system of free allocation, but to do that in a gradual way that ultimately by 2034 we will have 100% CBAM and 0% free allocation in place. But as Mike already indicated in the introduction, these developments are not the only ones that are taking place. We also see developments in the United States. And we actually, if we go back to the late 2000s, we already had some initial developments where border carbon adjustments were considered in several cap and trade bills that were before US Congress. But given that these cap and trade bills never came to pass, also the border carbon adjustment never came to pass. But we see renewed efforts by senators, at least on both sides of the aisle in the US, to try and introduce some form of border carbon adjustments. So we have the FAIR Act, which was introduced by Senators Peters and Coons in the 2021-22 year, as well as the Clean Competition Act, which was introduced by Senator Whitehouse, which both include some form of border carbon adjustment related to also the domestic environmental costs that would be incurred by US producers. But the support for these two acts is still somewhat unclear. Interestingly, this year we also likely will see another bill forthcoming on a so-called foreign pollution fee, but this one would come from a Republican legislator, Senator Cassidy. So very clearly, border carbon adjustments are on the agenda in the US as well. But also important to look elsewhere, because it's not just the EU and the US that we're talking about. Earlier this year, Taiwan adopted the Climate Change Response Act, which included an import measure, so an import carbon measure. We see in Japan that there is discussion or contemplation of putting in place a carbon levy on fossil fuel imports from 2028-2029. UK and Canada, we've already completed at least one round of consultation among stakeholders. And likewise in Australia, something similar will be forthcoming through the so-called carbon leakage review, which has as an explicit mandate to also look at the possibility of a CBAM in Australia. So we see lots of activity on BCA, not just limited to the EU. But then, as Michael also mentioned in the introduction, this may lead to a variety of reactions. And some of these reactions may be what some of the legislators want to see. We see maybe the potential adoption of carbon taxes in response to the EU CBAM in countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and we see the accession of Turkey to the Paris Agreement, all in a way one could argue positive developments. But then we also see other types of reactions. We see bargaining reactions from the United States, for example, which has been trying to get an exemption from the EU CBAM. And we also see a pure resistance against the efforts. So we have India and China raising questions about CBAM at the WTO, not launching any dispute just yet, but at least trying to raise it in committee discussions. But we also see a country like South Africa raising questions about CBAM when it comes to its link to climate change and arguing that it's not in line with principles of historical responsibility. So we see this variety of reactions, all of which underpinning the need to have some form of cooperation and at least some form of dialogue on BCAs at the international level. Now, these reactions ultimately are all linked to the external features of BCAs. And these external features in our report are fourfold. One is that they can be linked to the geographic scope. So, for example, a BCA like CBAM might either decide to exempt certain countries based on their development status or emission levels or climate ambition. It might be linked to the calculation of the adjustment. So what you see is that in the EU CBAM mitigation policies in third countries, if they are carbon pricing, they will be credited under the CBAM. But one could also argue that similar things might be done for other mitigation policies that are not carbon pricing. The determination of embedded emissions also has a clear link to what's happening in third countries, because that's, of course, where these emissions take place. So here the question is whether they should be based on actual emissions data or default values, or both. And last but not least, another external dimension of BCAs is how countries decide to use their revenues. So, for example, will they recycle back some of the revenues that they might make from the BCAs to affected trading partners? Now, to the question of why should we cooperate, I'll give first like a basic answer from a legal perspective. Well, cooperation is a core principle of international law, and not just general international law going back to the Declaration on Friendly Relations in 1970, but also very clearly on the international climate change law and international trade law. Even more so under the international trade law, one can argue that international cooperation is a necessity if one wants to pursue and defend a BCA on the basis of Article 20 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But more beyond these legal reasons, there are also political reasons and diplomatic reasons of why one wants to pursue cooperation. This includes trying to prevent the risk that countries adopt these measures under the guise of climate measures, but they're actually simply purely protectionism. It may be that we want to prevent trade retaliation, so tit-for-tat retaliation, as we've seen in the past, and more generally trade disputes emerging at the WTO. And it may also be from the perspective of climate change negotiations that we want to avoid the entrenchment of climate change negotiation positions, keeping in mind that for many developing countries, this is not just about industrial decarbonization. This is also about unmet promises of climate finance, historical responsibility, as we already saw. So broader questions that impinge on this particular debate. And lastly, we can also think about cooperation as a means to diffuse the best practices in the design and implementation of the BCAs as we see them emerge. Now, what could be the possible goals of international cooperation? And among the team, we identified 5 of them. The first one would be to promote transparency. So basically the sharing of information on the design, the implementation of BCAs, as well as their effects on emissions and trade. It could be about developing objectives and principles for BCAs. So based on the best practices that we see so far, what can we say about what should be the objectives and what should be basic guiding principles in future implementation? It could be more broadly about improving comparability between the mitigation policies of different countries by developing the methodologies that allow for this comparison and allow for the comparison of different types of mitigation policies as well as their effects. It could be about promoting harmonization. So trying to think of ways over time we can develop either product standards or standards for monitoring, reporting, and verifying emissions and emissions effects. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, it ultimately could be about the contribution to global climate ambition by either allowing using BCAs to strengthen domestic ambition or using them to strengthen third country ambition and implementation. Right, so when we look at the existing initiatives that are out there, we look at in our report at three factors or three dimensions. The first one is so-called inclusiveness. And here we refer to the extent to which an initiative is open to participation to states as well as non-state actors. So initiatives can be fully open to anyone, or they can be highly exclusive, like a proper climate club in the Bill Nordhaus sense. The second dimension that we look at is institutional strength, and here we comprise a few different things. One, the extent to which it's embedded in more permanent structures. Two is the capacity, so the resources that are at the availability of an initiative. And three, the extent is to which it's capable of standard setting, including potentially legally binding rules. And lastly, we examine the initiative's contributions to the 5 goals that I mentioned in the previous slide. Now, let's start with the first one, the G7 Climate Club, or as it's known now, the Climate Club. So the idea came from a proposal by then Finance Minister Olaf Scholz, and of course later the Chancellor, which led to an initiative in 2021-2022 by the German presidency to form a G7 Climate Club. And ultimately, the terms of reference for this Climate Club were adopted in December last year, with a view to then launch it later this year based on activities that are going on right now by Task Force. There's a website in the meantime also if you're interested in visiting it, but you can see that things are being prepared. Now, the Climate Club tries to focus on 3 pillars. The first is advancing ambitious and transparent mitigation policies. The second is focused on transforming industries. And the last one is boosting international climate cooperation and partnerships through voluntary contributions by the club members. Interestingly, it will have an interim secretariat and hopefully also later permanent secretariat with the OECD and the International Energy Agency. And as of September 2023, it has 27 members, although most of them are still focused or based OECD members. Moving on to the next initiative, and I'll reflect on all 3 of them in the slides that follow. So the next initiative is the GASA, the Global Arrangement for Sustainable Steel and Aluminium. So this all goes back to 2018 when then President Trump slapped a number of tariffs on steel and aluminium from different countries, including the EU. So steel 25% and aluminium 10%. And this led to retaliation including by the EU, imposing tariffs on things like bourbon and Harley-Davidsons, as well as WTO challenges, including again by the EU, as well as by other WTO members. Then in 2021, with the new president in place, there was actually a deal between the EU and the US. And one of the parts of the deal was that the EU could actually export steel and aluminium to the US under a so-called tariff rate quota system. It also agreed to suspend its WTO challenge against the US. But importantly, it launched the negotiations for this new arrangement, the GASA. Now, what the GASA is going to do depends very much on who you ask and whether you ask an EU policymaker or a US policymaker, because they have slightly different views on this. But the basics is that it will be related, it will focus on restricting market access on the one hand, based on the carbon intensity of steel and aluminium production, and on the other hand, based on what is called non-market access capacity, but which can be interpreted in a coded way, is focusing very much on heavily subsidized steel and aluminium from China. Like the G7, this is also open in principle to like-minded economies, but at the moment the negotiations are still taking place between the EU and the US. They were due to conclude by October, by the end of this month basically, but that deadline was missed. Now the idea is that it would end by the end of the year, but the positions are still quite far apart, and I'm sure that David and potentially others can comment on this as well. But whether a deal will be reached is quite uncertain at the moment. And then the last forum, or the last initiative that we looked at, is the International Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which was also launched in the last year, and now has 56 members, including also a number of developing country G20 countries. And the goal of the IFCMA is to optimize the global impact of emission reduction efforts through better data and information sharing, through mutual learning and mutual understanding, and ultimately through an inclusive multilateral dialogue, which has a clearly more political element. They're still in the first phase, which is to test methodologies to map and stocktake mitigation policies, as well as their effects. And in the second phase, these methodologies would then be applied to all of the IFCMA members. And importantly, the technical work that they're doing also includes developing methodologies for calculating sector as well as product level carbon intensity metrics, which might also link it to other initiatives, including the gas. Right, then moving on to the assessment, and I'm aware of the time, Michael, so I'll try and wrap this up in the next 3 minutes or so. So first, when it comes to inclusiveness and institutional strength, and just to be clear, all of these three initiatives are moving targets. So this is our initial impression of where they might stand in terms of inclusiveness and institutional strength. But when it comes to the inclusiveness, on the one hand, all of them seem to be open to participation by a number of countries. But if you look at it in more detail, you can also see that they're also somewhat exclusive. The GASA is exclusive in that it seems to clearly exclude the participation by China. The Climate Club seems to be somewhat exclusive in the sense that it has origins in the G7, which is composed of developed countries. And likewise, with the IFCMA and as well as the Climate Club, there will remain linkages to the OECD, which for some developing countries is still seen as an institution dominated by developed countries. And when it comes to the institutional strength, it's interesting to see that the flip side of this link to the OECD also means that there's capacity to build on for the IFCMA and the Climate Club. Then for the Climate Club, its longevity very much depends on the priorities of future presidencies, which always remain somewhat uncertain. It's interesting to note that there's no standard-setting mandate when it comes to the IFCMA and the Climate Club. But, and again, depending on how the negotiations will evolve, it might be possible that the GASA would ultimately lead to something more formal, something more prescriptive, including legally binding obligations. Now, when it comes to the contribution to these different goals, this is just, again, our first impression of how likely these different initiatives are meet the goals that we outlined. And I think the main conclusion that we can see deriving from that is that no ideal form emerges at this time. So GASA may well end up being a bellwether of whether we can actually identify common ground among those countries which have very divergent mitigation policies. IFCMA, maybe more positively, could be a starting point for a better understanding of the comparability of mitigation approaches, as well as some more technical work on the development of metrics and work on the transparency around climate policy design in different countries. And lastly, the Climate Club could then end up as a venue to also keep hope for more in-depth cooperation on industrial carbon decarbonization alive. But what we have seen in our work is also that there are some very clear obstacles to international cooperation. And these obstacles can be related to some path dependencies that are in place, because we have policy instruments that have been around in some cases for several decades. We also have frameworks and institutions and technologies for monitoring, reporting, and verification, which may have, in some cases, have been in place for even longer than these policy instruments. So we have to work with those existing frameworks and institutions and see how and when we can break those dependencies. But more broadly and related to that, we also face uphill domestic political struggle. Industrial decarbonization, carbon leakage have always been politically sensitive in many countries. But in some countries, we see also the political influence being even more disproportionate, with, as a good example, US steel industry playing a major role in swing states such as Ohio and Pennsylvania. We also know that a lot of the existing approaches and existing policies have been the result of often very carefully crafted political compromises. So we need to work around that as well. And lastly, we need to work with the fact that there's several levels of mistrust. Mistrust against trade cooperation in general among certain constituencies and the potential to deliver on climate benefits of that, but also mistrust around BCAs, which were reflected in some of the reactions to the CBAM that we saw. Now, on this somewhat sobering note, we don't want to draw final conclusions, but we do want to open it up also for further discussions, and hopefully the discussions will provide some reactions, but also in your Q&A, we look forward to your comments here. And these are some of the questions that we feel ought to be addressed. Knowing some of these obstacles, right, the path dependencies, the political, domestic politics, how can we evolve international cooperation over time in terms of participation? Should we start with fewer participants or with a greater number of participants over time? Should we just focus on a few major emitters and the major sectors in these emitters? Or should we actually look at multilateral forums? And likewise, should we focus on technical cooperation, on metrics, on methodologies, or should we at the same time maybe also pursue political cooperation to build trust? And then related to the first point, what role, if any, is there for multilateral institutions? WTO by now has also started to discuss BCAs at the request of China. So can we build on that? And importantly, how can all of these initiatives build on each other? How do we coordinate the GASA and work if it concludes and the IFCMA? How do we coordinate the IFCMA and the Future Climate Club? But also, how do we coordinate with other initiatives on the industrial decarbonization, such as the IDDI and other initiatives focusing very much on particular sectors? And last but not least, how do we connect all of these initiatives to the priorities for developing countries, which are not necessarily about industrial decarbonization, but as I said, may well be about climate finance, about historical responsibility, about loss and damage, all of these questions which are not necessarily within the remit of these individual initiatives. And with that, Michael, I'm going to hand it back over to you and to the discussants. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Haron. You can stop sharing the screen. So thanks for running through a lot of content in some 25 minutes. As Haron mentioned, we encourage the audience to use the Q&A function, the button on the bottom of the Zoom screen, to enter questions. But before we get to the open Q&A, we've invited a lineup of discussants, excellent experts that have worked on BCAs for many, many years and now also turning to the questions of cooperation, who will share with, we've shared the report, the draft report with them, and so they'll share some reactions and give us some thoughts on our assessment, but also recommendations and proposals in the report. And these are in alphabetical order: Katarina Holzer, who's a senior researcher at the Law School of the University of Eastern Finland; then David Kleiman, visiting fellow at Bruegel, the think tank in Brussels; and Katrina Rourke, who is the executive director of the Center for Climate and Trade in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all three of you for reading the report and joining us today. So we suggested about 5 minutes of reactions from your side, given our unfortunately tight timing of the webinar. And I would invite David to begin, because David does have to leave at the end of the hour to another appointment. David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Also for the consideration of the schedule that I'm running up against. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful and really interesting, particularly for those of us, I think, who have shared a deep interest in these issues and are very excited about the recent developments that we see in this field. And I thought that the paper, really does a wonderful scene setting and overview of those recent developments in a very concise manner. And I literally was, nodding all along while reading this paper yesterday. So thank you so much for the organizers of this panel and to the authors of the paper that we're discussing. It seems to me that this is one of these papers that are extremely difficult to comment on, because it is already really, rich and developed both in analytical approach and in terms of the substance, the information that it provides. So, an attempt to make suggestions for improvements is a pretty daunting task. But so I'll try to give my view against that background. What the paper does really is to set out an extremely valuable update of the broader landscape of recent climate and trade policies in the two most active jurisdictions. And perhaps more crucially, it provides, I thought, for an excellent, really systematic stock take of recent BCA cooperation initiatives, the G7 Club, the GSA, and the Inclusive Forum, of which I hope they will find a new acronym soon, which would, very much improve the chances of it to become a success. In terms of the analytical approach, it seems to me that the paper rightly identifies the relevant external dimensions of BCAs, and building on that, the pertinent objectives of BCA cooperation, of which you've outlined the 5 ones. And then really goes into these, advancing a systematic evaluation of these 3 different initiatives along the lines of the objectives. And in doing so, I feel, that you really nicely identify both the potential and of these initiatives to advance the 5 objectives you set out. Now, the one thing, and so 2 things I found particularly worth noting in regard of the paper, and I use my remaining 2 minutes on this, is that, the one thing first that struck me in reading your assessment of these initiatives is that 4 of the objectives that, you use as the benchmark for assessment are pretty much absolute no-brainers because they're so desirable and they're also feasible. And those 4 are essentially, I think, the enhanced transparency of BCAs, developing shared objective and principles, best practices, wonderful, improving comparability of methodologies to ensure interoperability of BCAs, more challenging, but absolutely desirable, and I feel, an imperative going forward. And of course, the objective of making a contribution to climate, to global climate ambition, being the necessary condition for any of this. So I thought it's really uplifting to learn that the IFCMA scores really high on high on potential to at least indirectly deliver on all 4 of these dimensions, and it's supported by a strong institutional infrastructure and a large diverse membership. So that's wonderful, and it seems that we've found a potential winner there that, at least, we can look at to, with hope and investments going forward to make this a success. A second major preliminary finding in your paper, I thought, is the observation that BCA harmonization, that 5th objective, of the harmonization objective, is extremely difficult to attain in any setting, and may not even be worth prioritizing at this early stage. Now, that finding reminded me, I must admit, of a recent transatlantic dialogue on climate and trade, in which I was asked to talk about potential modalities and fora for cooperation on carbon accounting methodology, standards, and approaches for verification. What I said in that context of that dialogue is that the idealist in me would really love to see harmonized approaches, harmonized methodologies on carbon measurement, product standards, and approaches to verification and various multilateral and plurilateral fora. But it appeared to me that it was, literally just simply unrealistic at this point in time. Why is that? Well, the EU has just launched its highly path-dependent CBAM with various, associated, MRV approaches that are deeply embedded in the EU's political economy and in the regulatory system and culture. Deviating from these approaches, not to even speak of the EU's method for adjustment, just does not seem particularly feasible or desirable at this point in time, given the other objectives that we still want to attain, and that we would have to attain in order to get to any sort of potential harmonization. So what I also argued elsewhere is that cooperation for deep integration BCA arrangements, as it was proposed in the Gaza context, would be elusive, and in this particular case also undesirable. So this goes beyond MRV and really transcends and goes towards harmonizing the method for adjustment. And that just, given the political economy constraints, just doesn't seem to be feasible, and we see early signs of that. Now, I will admit that my transatlantic audience on that day, half of it at least, did not take that message too well. But if this observation, and I'm closing with this, but if this observation holds true, perhaps we also have to rethink at least elements of the MRV harmonization objective and deep integration schemes more generally, and then aim for what is realistic at this stage of BCA cooperation. So to answer your question of what the starting point of BCA cooperation should be, I think it's to start with what we have, and that is to use CBAM and the rather surprising and somewhat impressive Brussels effect that exerts. So I think it's really should be at this point the center of attention, and this is from where perhaps bilaterally and plurilaterally a cooperation should evolve.
Wonderful. Thank you, David, for thoughtful comments. And I'll jump over to Katarina Holzer next. So Katarina, who's a senior researcher at the Law School of the University of Eastern Finland, and began working on BCAs as part of her dissertation a very long time ago. So you have accompanied this topic longer than probably any of us. Katarina, what are your thoughts on the report and the discussion, including David's comments, of course, if you want?
Thank you, Michael, and it's good to be with you today, and happy Halloween. I would like to congratulate you on this report because, as David, I found it extremely comprehensive, and it was very interesting to read it. And to be honest, as for David, for me, it was very difficult to find something, to an issue that you haven't dealt with in your report. Nevertheless, I have 3 comments to make. My first comment relates to the goals of international cooperation that you identified in your report. To those goals of transparency, share the principles, increasing comparability, harmonization, and global ambition, I would also add the goal of creating a perception of legality of BCAs. Because I'm not talking about legality as such, because that is defined by the rules, and the rules of the WTO as they are, and it can be changed only at the WTO. But I'm talking about the perception of legality, which is also important because it can influence the development of law on BCAs and through these informal processes. So this is my first comment. And probably also related goal of achieving an agreement on a waiver for BCAs, just to shield these BCAs for some time from legal challenges. My second comment relates to the forums for pursuing international cooperation. And I know that you decided not to deal with multilateral forums because, and I share that skepticism is unfeasible for the moment. But nevertheless, I think that the WTO, which is an organization specifically deals with these trade-related measures, and after all, it will be the WTO where the disputes will be brought against BCAs. I think that it's worth to also to include examination of the potential of the WTO for international cooperation BCAs, even if the cooperation are only possible on some elements of international cooperation, such as transparency. But nevertheless, the transparency rules and committee practices, deliberate function of the WTO can play an important role as a basis for international cooperation BCAs. And my third comment relates to your fourth goal on harmonization and what also David mentioned. I think this is very important. Probably it's one of the most realistic goals of international cooperation for the moment on BCAs. But here I can't agree with you completely on the role of G7 Climate Club for this goal, because you say that it's not in the terms of references. Actually, it is in the terms of references, and I can quote even that a major focus is one of the focuses is on the decarbonization of hard to abate industrial sectors by discussing and aiming to align as far as possible methodologies, etc. Of course, I agree that it is based on the work of other organizations, including Inclusive Forum, but nevertheless, I think that here the G7 Climate Club can play an important role. And of course, I agree with you as well that the G7 Climate Club is an uncertain forum for international cooperation on climate change because of its weak institutional structure, and all depends on political momentum and the presidency of countries, their political agenda and their priorities, and after all, on the development of geopolitical situation in the world. Well, this is what I wanted to add to this discussion today, and back to you, Michael.
Wonderful, Katerina, and thank you. Very sort of concise remarks, and yet a lot of content there. And I think perception of legality, I would maybe translate as commitment, an expressed commitment to the rule-based order. Indeed, something where I think there's differences between different actors. Speaking of differences between different actors, coming to Katerina, you're on my side of the Atlantic, and of course, we're exposed to very different political economy, including a different climate policy context. So you witness and follow the debates in Washington, D.C., and how would you sort of react from this slightly different starting point on our assessment in the report, but also what you heard David and Katerina suggest?
Yeah, thank you. So first, congratulations on the report. I too was reading it and was very grateful to you for laying out so comprehensively where we are, the different pieces moving, but also this refreshing take that you're leading with a cooperation frame. So much of this conversation is about unilateral action and trying to cooperate in that context, and you're here leading with the avenues for cooperation. So thank you. It is refreshing to think about the potential to be building bridges rather than walls through the trading system. The U.S. perspective, maybe as an artifact of where we are in climate policy, is from some parties so much more oriented to leading with cooperation. I think the global arrangement is an indication of that. The United States could have unilaterally adapted our steel and aluminum tariffs to a carbon intensity frame. Instead, we invited a partner to help us figure out how to do that appropriately. And the foreign pollution fee that we are anticipating to come out from Senator Cassidy, a Republican in the Senate, spends a whole lot of effort trying to articulate what pathways forward look like for cooperation with like-minded countries, climate-ambitious countries, but also with emerging markets who we want to lift along with us, enhance their climate ambition, but also trade with them aggressively. This cooperation frame also echoed in how many on the right come to the climate and trade perspective, recognizing that the United States is a carbon efficient manufacturer of all sorts of things and wanting to use that as a lever to export more, everything from microchips to natural gas. There was a lot of ink spilled in advance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine about displacing Russian natural gas with lower methane US natural gas. And that was a message coming from Republicans. So this climate and trade frame on this side of the Atlantic is one with a strong orientation towards cooperation, opening avenues for more trade, recognizing that we can export solutions, recognizing that we have to spend $9.5 trillion per year to achieve net zero, and that can and should be framed as a business opportunity for firms that are aggressively decarbonizing. And so that sort of orientation towards cooperation is shaping a lot of the discussions in DC. We even see that in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act, a package of proposals largely investing in the US economy, in the US manufacturing sector, US decarbonization. And in the wake of that, the White House has been enacting bilateral trade agreements to try and bring other partners in the tent so that we can trade with them more, secure supply chains for decarbonization more. So this orientation towards cooperation, palpable on this side of the Atlantic. I also want to point out that I don't want to describe this as sort of a missing frame in the report, so much as I think, maybe it's the Washington orientation. One of the outcomes of the G7 Leaders Summit was is it called the Clean Energy Action Plan, something like this, where they talked about how each partner may use different domestic policies to achieve decarbonization, recognizing that there are a lot of different political obligations that G7 partners have to domestic constituencies. The US, a storied history of trying to enact carbon pricing unsuccessfully to date. Instead, we moved for investment. Japan has said again and again that it's really difficult for them to raise their domestic carbon pricing. They're looking for other mechanisms for industrial decarbonization. Right, we have to recognize that everybody's in a different place. And so when you talk about shared objectives and principles, comparability, harmonization, the sort of note that haunts me is the flip side of what the Inclusive Forum is trying to achieve. We're not trying to compare the effectiveness of policies. We're trying to figure out how we can compare the outcomes of policies. Our goal is global decarbonization. Our goal is a less carbon-intensive industrial sector. If we can come to this understanding that what we're looking for is a lower intensity in the future, then that can be the basis for cooperation. And I think this comes back to your point, David, about figuring out how we can get to harmonization on MRV, which can be a really strong foundation. All of the countries that currently have mandatory reporting requirements for greenhouse gas emissions largely require reporting of the very same things, slight differences in methodologies. But if this can be the nugget of cooperation, that we all agree that our goal is to decarbonize, it could be magic, right? It's Halloween, so whatever voodoo can lower emissions, terrific. Let's figure out how we can cooperate, recognizing the differences in policy approaches across countries, recognizing that in that context, we want to figure out how to use trade tools to improve accountability for the carbon intensity of your operations, like the CBAM, but also get more goods out into the global economy to facilitate decarbonization. If we agree that carbon intensity is the point of comparison between these systems, then that's a place where we can really move forward. And I hope gain more buy-in from as many partners as possible, also striving for industrial decarbonization, but in different ways. Thanks for the opportunity to comment today.
And thank you for joining us, Katrina, and for, I think, a very passionate sort of plea to focus not only on the policy designs, but really what do they actually achieve? As for the great pumpkin rising from the pumpkin patch on Halloween, I'll keep my breath. I'll keep holding my breath. But it is true. I think there are common starting points, and all these MRV standards have a common origin. David, I know that you might have to. He had to leave, so thanking him as well for having joined us. So before we turn to the Q&A, oh no, you just switched down. Okay, so if you do have to leave us, thanks again. And before we turn to the questions in the Q&A, there's not terribly many yet, so I encourage the audience to also type in questions if you still have something also sparked by our discussants. I will invite the two remaining co-authors that haven't spoken yet, namely Kasturi Das, who is a professor at the Institute of Management Technology in Ghaziabad, just by Delhi in India, and then Susanne Dröge, who is head of Department for Climate Action and Energy at the Federal Environment Agency, or Umweltbundesamt, in Germany, to share some reactions to this excellent insight shared by the discussants with us, and any additional thoughts that you would like to bring in. And I'll start with Kasturi. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining from. I would keep my comments really brief and draw on what has already been spoken. If we look at the wider context of today's world, I think we can see that the world is witness to a trend of deglobalization and rise of some kind of nationalism and protectionist, so-called quote unquote, trade and industrial policies in different corners of the world. And it's not only about one part of the globe. In such a scenario, there is a high risk that domestic interests and political imperatives might dominate over international cooperation initiatives. So, unless and until the contours of such cooperation are broadly aligned with domestic approaches, and the recent developments in the context of Gaza, I think indicates towards the complexity and the challenges are there. My second point is that, as already mentioned, and I would like to emphasize on that in our report, that if you look at BCAs, there is also a path dependence in terms of the history, and historically it is embroiled in the controversy over various reasons, including its alleged protectionist intents and various other implications. If you look at it from the perspectives of the global South, of climate justice, equity, and so on. In such kind of historical backdrop, I don't think cooperation, around BCAs is going to be very easy, and a truly effective and inclusive cooperation around BCAs may not be easy to materialize in a hurry, and it may take time. As we can see that none of the initiatives we have looked at are actually a perfect candidate for cooperation as of now, but we understand that it is an evolving context. The third point I would like to mention here is that flows from my second point. There is a mistrust regarding BCAs and any cooperation regarding BCAs. This we can see particularly in the context of the EU CBAM. Now, in that context, I think how we can take the cooperation forward. I think if we look at any cooperation, the environmental ground may play a very important role in terms of its legitimacy. And I think much would also depend on how the cooperation around BC is designed, say as part of any climate club kind of initiative. For instance, if you really want to make it an inclusive approach, then a BCA that is accompanied by other approaches which are aimed at supporting potential members from the global South, in terms of by providing, say, finance, technology transfer, or capacity building, say, in terms of MRB and so on, then that might fly better compared to a club which will have only BCA, but not look into such kind of, incentives, which might be really important and help countries, particularly from the global South, to advance their decarbonization initiatives, particularly industrial decarbonization. The fourth point I'd like to mention is I think it's a positive thing that we get to see in the context of ICMA and also the related work associated with G7 Climate Club, where they're trying to look at the comparability. And we have seen that, our esteemed commentators have mentioned how difficult it is to go for harmonization. But I think in that context, comparability, if we can come up with methodologies which is effective and workable, might be really helpful, because as our commentators have mentioned, that there are different approaches to climate mitigation in different parts of the globe, and not all the countries may be prepared to directly go for carbon tax or cap and trade kind of pricing kind of policies, but they may otherwise be doing certain things which would have implications if you look at the climate mitigation point of view. So if we have some effective methodology for comparability, then that might be really helpful. Finally, I would like to mention, I agree with Katrina when she mentioned about the role of multilateral forums like UNFCCC and WTO. I understand and we agree what we agreed in the report that we mentioned, that multilateral cooperation has not advanced that much. However, given that multilateral approaches do fare better in terms of inclusivity and legitimacy, I think this avenue cannot be ruled out as of now, and there may be scope for further work in this space. So I stop at that and look forward to hear from Susanne and other commentators. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasturi. And over to Susanne, who in Germany is, of course, closest of us all to the developments, especially on the Climate Club, which originated there.
Yes, very briefly, I would like to add some more perspective to the club. And I think we in our project looked at the cooperation on BCAs, which as such is already a very ambitious thing to do. But I recall Timmermans' framing of this CBAM at one of the COPs where he said a new way to cooperate on climate ambition. And I thought, well, that's a way to twist it. And I think, but that's the only way to twist it, I think, because as Kasturi has pointed out, we are living in times where multilateralism is in decline. So if like the EU is proposing and installing this kind of policy tool, it has to be done in a cooperative manner. And for the G7 club, I would like to add that I feel it's headed for a G20 project driven by the G7. We have seen that at the summits this year and potentially next year's summits of the G7 the Climate Club will be pushed towards the G20 as big emitters, and will particularly look into the energy-intensive industries, and the CBAM will be subject to discussions in the task force. I know that at COP28, the German pavilion will host an event on the Climate Club again. So I also expect that this will be a forum where the cooperation on BCA will be continued, although not in a very systematic way, but always attached to cooperation on decarbonization of specific sectors. And maybe and the last point is that now we will enter a phase where the technical cooperation, which has been mentioned as contrary maybe to the political one, the technical one is gaining ground because now the EU has to find out about the carbon embedded in the traded goods. And that is an inroad to cooperation that is not this way of excited anti-whatever globalization protectionism this side of the story, but rather the technical cooperation will inform the debate as the IFCMA does as a forum. And I would stop here in order to hear from our audience whether they have questions in this respect. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susanne. Thanks to all who have now spoken, presented, responded. And let me turn in the remaining just about 10 minutes to some of the questions that have come in the Q&A. And I'll start with questions by Sangeeta Godbole. And it's really to anybody, both of the presenters and the discussants who want to pick it up. I think there is also a question directed directly at Haro, but let's first start with the first question in the Q&A. And that's the impact of border carbon adjustments on developing countries and essentially their development on citizens, on consumer prices, etc. It's a very, I think, legitimate question to wonder if countries like, say, India are incentivized by policies like the CBAM to introduce ambitious carbon prices to lower the impact of the CBAM for their exported goods to those countries imposing border carbon adjustments. What are the domestic implications, the distributional implications? And do you feel that this is an underappreciated issue? Do you think this will resolve itself? Is this something where cooperation could work out? Could one maybe think about having some sort of tiered, like the IMF's proposal of sort of tiered carbon prices, where developing countries would be accepted to have a lower carbon price and that be considered nonetheless sort of in line with their domestic circumstances? Any thoughts from the panelists on this first question? Haro, you raise your hand, and then I see Katarina. Let's go in that sequence. So Haro quickly, and then Katarina.
Yeah, I'll take both of Sangeeta's questions together, because for me they're a prime example of how from a country in the global south you could look at BCAs. The question is not about BCAs and trying to make sure that there's carbon pricing everywhere, but it's rather about what does this mean for our priorities, and which may well be to adapt to climate change. And I think it's important for us to really focus or stand still and think about that, because if for a country like, so you mentioned the Brussels effect, or David mentioned the Brussels effect, and Michael, you also talked about the effects of other countries adopting carbon prices, right? Like, from our perspective, one could see, well, that's great. Like, more countries are adopting carbon prices, strengthening their ambition. But if the end result is that consumers in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, India actually face higher prices and they can't deal with that because they have other priorities, then we are creating a problem. And lots of developing countries are trying to connect it. And I think if you're trying to disconnect it, you're basically making these other priorities for them less of a priority for us. Again, based in the global north. And I think we need to be very careful with how we're treating it, and we cannot just say, well, this is not related, right? Like, we're talking about only industrial decarbonization, and that is the main focus for our initiative. Now, we need to keep on thinking about, well, how does that link to your priorities? And I think the very obvious key will be ultimately, means of implementation in UNFCCC jargon, right? Like, so financial support and technological support. That means that initiatives would need to have at least some component when it comes to providing finance. And in a way, the G7 Climate Club has that in this vaguely worded third pillar. But I think also for other initiatives, it's important to establish that link as well. Because otherwise, I think the levels of mistrust that both Kasturi and I talked about will probably continue to exist.
Perfect. Thank you, Harold. Katja and Kasturi, before you turn to the second question by the same person, Sangeeta, was also, how would this potentially affect those developing countries' ability to meet their own climate pledges? Could this be sort of positive or counterproductive if it means that resources are now reshifted or shifted and refocused? Katalina, if you might also reflect on that, but feel free to focus on the first question.
Yeah, maybe just for the first question, my answer would be that I understand that the prices in the economy will go up with the introduction of such price-based mechanisms. But if I were developing countries, I would go for it, because it's better to keep the revenues in their own budget than to let the EU collect this.
Perfect. Thank you, Katja. And Kasturi.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I would like to respond, adding to what has already been said to Sangeeta Godbole's comments and questions. I think, regarding the first question that has been raised, I think that's a genuine concern, because if you look at, say, EU ETS, it started way back, we all know, and it has gone through the entire process. And only now, after so many years, this conversation has started of moving from free allocation to, this kind of pricing. And if you look at developing countries, even if they start as, let me take the example of India. India, for instance, is now planning to come up with a cap and trade system. Now, obviously, it will take a lot of time before it reaches a level which is comparable in terms of price also. So that is not going to happen very easily and overnight. So that is one point. However, I would like to mention, and that is the point I touched upon, why comparability is important. Because if you again look at India, for instance, India may not have a full-fledged cap and trade system. However, India does have very high fuel tax. And how do you actually look at the implication of that high fuel tax in terms of carbon pricing? India did have already PAT scheme, the REC scheme, and all these have carbon pricing implications. So it is not the case if we look at a country like India that cap and trade or carbon tax is the only way that pricing can be done and mitigation approaches are being undertaken. So it is not that consumers are not getting impacted by such prices already, even if you don't have CBAM. in place. So it is happening already, but if you have to go for really a mechanism like cap and trade, etc., I don't think it can happen overnight. And coming to Sangeeta's next question, whether it will take away resources from NDCs, I think it all depends on we are talking about cooperation here. We are not talking about EU CBAM per se. But if you have a cooperation involving BCA, as I mentioned, much would depend on the design elements of that, that cooperation initiative involving BCA. So if it is developed in such a way that it actually incentivizes further decarbonization initiative in the developing countries, then that might actually be helpful, and it may be in tune with the NDCs. We cannot rule out that possibility. So it all depends on how it is designed and how it is getting implemented. So we cannot always say that it is going to take away resources and not going to help decarbonization. However, the design elements have to incorporate such approaches if it really has to be, helping the decarbonization process. I think I'd stop at that.
All right, thank you, Kasturi. Well, we are sort of hitting very close to the scheduled ending time, and I can see that my colleagues are already responding to the remaining questions in writing. If, however, Susanne or Katrina, you very briefly want to respond to this idea of we have multiple initiatives looking at industrial decarbonization, harmonization, standards, etc. Whether there's any way to prioritize or align and avoid overlap, please do. And if you don't want to, it's also fine. Then I'll just close. Go ahead, Katrina, please.
Yeah, so I think, Kasturi, you said that we have a lot of different pathways for cooperation, but none of them are perfect and will ultimately be how we end up cooperating. And I think that's true. We're in early days of trying to understand how we cooperate in the trading system on this new set of priorities. And because we are in early days, it is really helpful to have all of these different initiatives underway. We didn't sort of magic our way into the WTO as it exists. It was a product of long conversation, of trying several different things, coming to agreements in smaller groups. I conceive that this sort of new global trading system that cares a lot more about relative carbon intensity will build itself in much the same way. We have to start where we can, find agreement where we can amongst like-minded partners, take the best ideas from these different operators, sort of smash them all together when the appetite arises. But we do not yet have evidence that the multilateral process can possibly accommodate these conversations in a productive way. And so let's move forward in these bilateral, mini-lateral approaches until we can ascend to a more productive global conversation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Katrina. And I think Susanne is kindly also signaling to me she did respond to a similar question in the written Q&A already. So it would duplicate in the responses. But to all of you, again, thanks so much for joining us, for sharing your insights, thoughts, for reacting to the paper. A reminder that the paper will be launched by Climate Strategies ahead of COP28, and all of those who've registered for the webinar today will receive a notification that it's available online. Other than that, thank you for having participated and joined on what I think is a discussion of a very important and rapidly evolving topic. And I'm sure we will be crossing paths again on the same topic going forward. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.